nastiest submissions in UFC history. During the UFC's 30-year history, we've seen some crazy and unexpected finishes, but none seem to make us gasp the way a well-executed and timed submission does. Join us in this video as we discuss 10 of the nastiest submissions to ever go down in the UFC octagon. Number 10. Frank Mir vs. Brock Lesnar. When news broke that Brock Lesnar would be making the switch from the WWE to the UFC, it was considered one of the largest crossovers in the history of sports. He would make his highly anticipated debut against none other than the heavyweight king Frank Mir. When the pair met at UFC 81, we were certain this was going to be an instant classic, and the competitors did not disappoint. Many pegged Lesnar as the favorite and were adamant it wouldn't be long before he was a world champion. Within minutes of the first bell, things were going exactly to plan for Lesnar. He quickly scored a takedown and began hammering down on Mir from above. However, Mir was able to roll out and take hold of Lesnar's leg before transitioning into a nasty knee bar. This forced Lesnar to tap immediately. Any longer and the debut star could have suffered a devastating injury. Number 9. Chung Chan Sung vs. Leonard Garcia. When the Korean Zombie faced off against Leonard Garcia at UFC Fight Night 24, we guarantee not a single fan could have imagined how this one would end. Sung would be the first in UFC history to successfully pull off a submission known as the Twister, first popularized by the elite grappler Eddie Bravo. This unique position locks up multiple parts of the body at once and implements a twisting torque that is physically unbearable. Just before the end of the second round, Sung locked Garcia in the twister and began pulling his neck, creating an immense amount of pressure on the head and spine. It wasn't longer before Garcia was begging for mercy and tapped out with just 1 second left in the round. This is definitely a submission you don't want to get caught in. Number 8. Demetrious Johnson vs. Ray Borg. Demetrious Johnson is often considered the UFC's greatest ever flyweight champion. At the height of his career, Johnson defended his title a record 11 times. Mighty Mouse is known for his unique style, and no better example of this came when he faced off against Ray Borg back in 2017. Johnson dominated Borg for 5 rounds when they met at UFC 216, and 2 minutes before the final bell, he pulled off one of the nastiest submissions in the history of MMA. Mighty Mouse locked in a tight body lock around Borg's waist before lifting him into the air in a suplex-like fashion. But on the way down, Johnson caught the arm of Borg and locked in a tight armbar before he even hit the ground. Not only should this be considered the nastiest submission in UFC history, but it's also one of the most aesthetically pleasing. For Demetrious Johnson, it was just another day at the office. Number 7. Jon Jones vs. Lyoto Machida. We may never see a fighter like Jon Jones ever again when he eventually retires. A light heavyweight who moved like a featherweight, has hands that could finish anyone, and wrestling a D1 superstar would be proud of. He really is the full package. Many fighters have been on the receiving end of a vicious beating from the former longtime light heavyweight champ, whereas others like Lyoto Machida have had to endure his elite submission skills. Whenever the pair met at UFC 140, it didn't take long for Jones to crush Machida's dreams of becoming the champion. Just before the end of the second round, Jones locked in one of the tightest standing guillotines we have ever seen. The referee had no idea Machida was out cold until the champ dropped his lifeless body to the ground. It was truly one of the most devastating finishes ever witnessed in the UFC. Number 6. KHABIB Nurmagomedov vs. Conor McGregor. UFC 229 will forever be remembered as one of the most hyped-up events ever put on by the promotion. They matched up the Irish superstar Conor McGregor with the dominant and undefeated Dagestani wrestler and lightweight champion KHABIB Nurmagomedov. The Dagestani had been tearing through opponents in the lead-up to the McGregor fight, but the Irishman was determined to end his streak. In the lead-up to the fight, McGregor and KHABIB built up quite the rivalry, which sometimes got pretty ugly. When the pair finally met inside the octagon, fans would see 4 rounds of action in which KHABIB mostly dominated. The Dagestani would eventually lock up a devastating neck crank in round 4 that looked like it was close to breaking Conor's face before the Irishman ultimately tapped. Number 5. Paul Craig vs. Jamal Hill. Jamal Hill suffered the only loss of his UFC back at UFC 263 against the Scottish submission specialist Paul Craig. When the pair met inside the UFC's octagon, the fight was evenly matched until Hill caught in one of the nastiest arm bars we've ever seen. As Craig locked in the submission, he dislocated Hill's arm at the elbow joint, ultimately rendering it useless. But unfortunately, the ref was unaware that Hill was down to one arm and allowed the fight to continue. Following this, Craig transitioned into a triangle choke and landed an array of punches on Hill's face until the ref finally decided to stop the bout. To this day, it's considered one of the worst armbar submissions in UFC history. Number 4. Ronda Rousey. It goes without saying that women's MMA would not be where it is today without the patriarch of the sport, Ronda Rousey. At one time, she was one of the highest-earning pay-per-view stars and revolutionized how we saw women in the fight game. Ronda had been on an impressive 4-fight win streak in the UFC when she was matched up with the dangerous and experienced Cat Zingano. The pair were scheduled to meet inside the octagon at UFC 184, and this would be a fight that didn't disappoint. The champ would finish her opponent in just 14 seconds. Moments after the fight began, Rousey used her expertise in judo to throw her opponent to the ground. But just before Zingano hit the ground, Ronda had already transitioned the throw into an extremely tight armbar that looked like it could have broken the challenger's arm had she not immediately tapped. To this day, the submission is still the fastest in UFC history. Number 3. Nate Diaz vs. Takanori Gomi. While we all know Nate Diaz as the cardio machine that never runs out of fuel, at times we forget his first true love was Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. The younger of the Diaz brothers has held his black belt since 2012, and on rare occasions we see him put these skills to use as he locks up a tight submission for the victory. One of his unfortunate victims was Takanori Gomi, who shared the cage with Diaz back at UFC 135. While the fight was eventually matched in the first round, the Stockton native would lock Gomi in a triangle in the last minute of the round. Further showing off his elite submission skills, Diaz elegantly transitioned into a tight armbar that looked seconds away from breaking Gomi's before he tapped. This fight reminded both competitors and fans that Diaz is just as devastating on the ground as he is on the feet. Number 2. BJ Penn vs. Matt Hughes. BJ Penn is undoubtedly one of the best performers to ever grace the UFC, and that's why his unfortunate downfall was the toughest to watch. But during his initial rise, Penn was feared throughout his division and was a formidable contender. When he earned a third shot at the UFC's welterweight title, which went down at UFC 46, he would have to get through Matt Hughes if he wanted the gold around his waist. Hughes had been on an impressive win streak, and Penn entered the fight as a clear underdog. But this is what we love about the sport, because you just never know what's going to happen once the cage door is shut. Penn showed off his elite skill set and stuffed nearly all of the All-American wrestlers' attempts at taking the fight to the ground. Eventually, the contender landed a strong overhand that sent Hughes crumbling to the canvas. Penn went on to smash Hughes from above, forcing him to turn his back, and that was it. The contender locked the champ in an extremely tight rear naked choke, and fans in the arena could see Hughes turning blue seconds before he tapped. While this was a nasty submission, it is also considered one of the most iconic over a competitor such as Hughes. Number 1. Frank Mir vs. Antonio Nogueira. Often considered the heavyweight's greatest ever jiu-jitsu practitioner inside the UFC's octagon, it's no surprise that Frank Mir appears twice on our list. He was so agile for a man his size, and his tremendous squeeze ensured that once he locked an opponent in a submission, there was very little chance of escape. It's no wonder that in the lead-up to the fight against Antonio Nogueira at UFC 140, he'd previously broken the bones of his opponents, but none seemed as horrid as what he did to Nogueira. No one expected Mir to earn a submission victory, considering the Brazilian was a legendary jiu-jitsu practitioner. However, following a ground and pound from Nogueira, Mir managed to survive and latched onto the Brazilian's arm before locking in a tight kimura. He applied a tremendous amount of force, and unfortunately, Nogueira didn't tap before his arm snapped to one of the nastiest submissions ever witnessed in the UFC. Those are our top picks for the 10 nastiest submissions in UFC history. Let us know in the comments which you think was the most devastating and if we missed any of your favorite submission finishes. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more like this, hit that subscribe button and follow along for weekly uploads. As always, thanks for watching and we'll see you next time.